Welcome everyone. My name is Chisom Udeze. I am the founder of Diversify. I am an economist and I am enthusiastic about technology, although I also am quite generally suspicious. So it's this fine line. It's a love-hate relationship. So I'm really happy to be here today to talk about AI ethics. I am very engaged in conversations around ethics, especially from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And I think it'd be very refreshing to learn and how does this apply within AI. I know some things about technology. My partner is a techie, so I'm learning a lot in that sense. But it's always nice to engage in the conversation beyond just like talking to my partner at home and freaking out about something. So happy to be here. Catherine, I'm going to prompt you to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about you, and just to remind everyone who's here, if you have questions along the way, please pop them in the chat and I will be sure to get back to it during Q&A. I think this session is an hour, 15 minutes. Is that correct? Yes, and we will try to do about 45 minutes of Q&A and then reserve the last 45 minutes of panel discussions and then reserve the last 30 minutes for the Q&A. So Catherine, tell me about yourself. I know you, but tell us about you.
Sure. So my name is Catherine Boy, and I've founded my consultancy agency called Boy Consulting. And I do consultancy for AI ethics. And one of my recent customers was DNB. And I got into this because I wanted to know what the hype was all about in AI. And at first, I was reluctant to continue in AI because I didn't feel like I had enough of the math skills to become really good at it. And so I sort of took a detour. But then I went on this conference in South Korea where I was presenting the work of a colleague. And I presented on gender bias in AI. And after me was a presentation by this AI professor. And sitting there, I just realized how much I know about gender bias in AI, despite not having worked so hard to gain that knowledge, in my opinion, because it's such a natural interest to me. But also listening to that AI professor, it's this is a conference about gender bias in AI, and he's not mentioning a lot of important things. He's just talking about how AI works, whereas the people in the audience, whom I know, who works with gender equality and diversity and the research on these things, they understand so little of what he's saying. And it's so hard for them to tackle this issue because they don't understand the technical side. And so I realized that I'm not the best in AI. I'm not the best in gender equality, but I know enough about both things to be this bridge between the two. And I think it's just really important that more technologists understand social issues more. So yeah, that's how I got into it.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for talking a bit about, how you got into AI ethics. So you talked about gender bias. Can you speak a bit to what you mean when you talk about gender bias, for those of us here who don't know about it? Sure. And how can it show up? So maybe one or two examples that come up for you.
So the first thing to just mention is AI is already here. It is not the iRobot that we're waiting for. It's not the personal assistant in her. AI is something as simple as when you're typing on your phone and it suggests the next word when it autocorrects you, or when you Google something and it tries to show you what it thinks you're interested in and which ads to show you. All of that is AI, the facial recognition on your phone. And the way that AI can have gender bias is that when I try to open my phone with my face, it'll work less well for me because I'm not a white man, because those are mainly trained on white male faces, and same with the voice assistants. And also, but the worst example that it's probably my favorite example because it just shows so many things. It's when Amazon tried to create an AI to sort resumes, and it just sorted out all the women because it just saw a pattern like, hey, Amazon, you tend to hire like 80% men, so here are all the men. And yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. I think it's interesting to see how, I mean, bias that, we talk about when you do work around diversity and inclusion, that also translates into bias within AI. And I think that the primary reason for that is that behind AI are people. There are people who write the codes. There are people who build the programs, the systems, and the structures on which those AI then, are introduced into the world. So on that note, I want to talk a bit around diversity and inclusion. And while I know that this is not your field, we have had conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So what impact or what relevance do you think DEIB has to artificial intelligence?
I mean, it's not just about like who makes it and for whom, like white young men solving the problems the white young men have. Like, Facebook started because Zuckerberg wanted to know who was single. But it's even more than that, because even if you try to find out which ones are the best candidates, and you don't know that there is noise in your data, and that noise is gender, then you're not gonna find the best candidate. So if you don't understand how AI can pick up the noise from biased data, and you don't understand how your data can be biased, and how the issues that are in AI they're not unique to AI. They're just social issues from the world that the AI embeds. It's not a unique issue in AI that women aren't hired by Amazon. That's like an issue in our world, in the tech world. And
yeah, I think that's interesting, especially when you think about it from the construct. Just to add to that, I think intersectionality is also quite important, because even when you have men building technology, for example, it's for men. Like, are all the men who interact with that technology, who will buy that product, who will use that product, are they represented in the foundations? Are they represented in the code? Are they represented in the systems and the structures that have been built? And I think that's interesting, just looking at the interplay between diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging with artificial intelligence, because ultimately, even within diversity and equity and inclusion, we often talk about people. Of course, we talk about workplaces, structures, tech, but ultimately behind it all are people, right? And I think that's the point you're making here is, the challenges that AI I guess shows in the world or has is not unique to AI, but it is unique to people. It is unique to societal and structural inequities. Is that right?
Yeah, but like you mentioned intersectionality, which is like such an important concept in feminism that like not a lot of developers know about, because if you're making a facial recognition and you want to make sure that it's not biased, and you don't know about this concept of intersectionality, you can inadvertently make a facial recognition, and you can test it that it doesn't is not biased towards women, and then you can test it that it's not biased towards people of color. But then if you don't actually test it for women of color, you might actually end up making a facial recognition system that does not work for them, but might look like it's not biased on paper, but in reality it is, which studies have shown that like facial recognition systems works worse for women in general, but it works even worse for women of color.
Which is good. I think I can't pronounce your name well, and I'm sorry if I destroy this. It is Emoke. As also said in the chat, facial recognition is also very bad for me. 4 times out of 5. Oh yeah, I got it right. 4 times out of 5, it doesn't recognize me, and she's a white young woman. And I think as well, something to nuance here is that even when you are aware of intersectionality, when you don't live an experience, you do not know that experience. You have to wear a shoe to know where it hurts, which is why it's not just important to test on the potential users, it's also important to include different intersections of the users, because my awareness, intersectionality is like my love language when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I've studied it a lot, but, I still have blind spots. I don't know what it is to be, a middle-aged white man or a young white man or a brown man or a Muslim man. I can think and, read and learn, but unless you actually get those voices in the room as well, I think you will miss valuable aspects that connects you closer to them. So this leads me to my next question for you, also just talking, I guess, last question around bias, and then we can kind of move a bit towards looking at how we can better understand AI. But in terms of how can we become more aware of bias in technology? So we know that this is, and I very much acknowledge that this is a loaded question, but in terms of what can I do to be better aware of potential bias in technology that I use, especially when that say, for example, technology is not biased towards me or against me?
I like what you said earlier, that you're sort of skeptical, and I think everybody should be. You should be critical to algorithms, and you should be curious about how you're being processed by an algorithm. I think comparing notes is a good thing. Like, if something isn't working well for you, I've seen so many women internalizing it and thinking that there's something wrong with them, that the Siri isn't working for them, when in reality Siri just sucks for female voices. I think it's so important to not think that there's something wrong with you because the tag isn't working for you, but to compare notes with other people and see who is the tag working for and who is it not working for, and to be curious about other people's perspectives. But also, this is these issues don't just come from because people don't understand what it's like to be a woman or a minority when they're making these things. There's a lack of understanding there. It's also about not taking responsibility for it and no one forcing them, keeping them accountable. Big tech don't have to make this inclusive. Google is well aware and Apple knows about this issue. They just choose not to fix it because they don't have to, because there's no outrage. They're still selling the stuff they want to sell. They're still making the money they want to make.
And what are some of the repercussions of this bias on, say, people who are affected by it? So women, people of color, marginalized groups, and even some men as well, or a lot of men, depending on who actually made the tech, right? So what are some of the repercussions?
So the main thing is that there's just even more barriers to your already barriered life. I mean, at best, it's a minor inconvenience. So it's a bit inconvenient that Siri works less well for you, but it also affects how well you perform in your job. There are studies who show that female doctors who use this dictating tool to write their journals, they're actually not able to perform the job as well as men, because the tool, they have to spend more time correcting the mistakes of the technology. But at the very worst, this is about life and death. like AIs that help doctors diagnose, but then it doesn't pick up stuff that's like specific for females, like how our strokes are, when we have a stroke, we have different symptoms. Or in the US, where they use an AI to help judges decide who should get probation or not. And it usually suggests that white men should be let out of prison, whereas men of color should remain inside. And so it can be like a minor inconvenience at best, but at worst, it's really about life and death.
And I think like also to add to that and contextualize, how bias shows up. There's been a lot of studies and reports on this, one of which was even how it affects the type of credit you get, the type of loans you get. There was a couple who went to apply for, I think it was an Apple or something credit card.
It was, yeah,
Apple Card, right? And the woman had actually earned more than her husband, and they both applied, and he got a relatively higher credit allowance than she did, and that is a failure in AI as well, especially when they tell you that it's based on how much you earn or this or that, right? And there are also situations where, like you spoke about, where it leads to misdiagnosis, and that could end up in that could be fatal. And of course, thinking about what access you have economically, if you cannot get the right loans to buy the house you want to buy, or, to buy the car that you need. And I think that it affects a lot of people more than we are actually aware, especially since, as you know, and Catherine, we interact with AI in some form or means, every single day, as long as, we're not recluses staying at home, we interact with some level of AI. And I think that's really important to grasp as to how impactful this can be.
But like what is so sad is like it can like oppress you and just keep you in this oppressive bubble. Like, let's say you're from a community that has like a lower income, and this ad algorithm decides to target people in that area with higher with credit cards that are just have worse worse rates for you because you're desperate. You're more likely to be desperate in that area for credit, and then you end up getting these offers for worse credit cards, and then you end up paying more for the same amount of money, and then you just become more poor because you're targeted by those algorithms. And these things actually happen, and that's like why it's so sad. It keeps you in this, it oppresses you and then just keeps you there at the very worst.
I think as well, one of the reasons why this ties in very well into conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion is also, we've talked about intersectionality and seeing that it affects, so I know like a lot of this conversation we've had today is so far, we've talked about gender, we've talked about men, but it literally affects everything. It affects people on a basis of religion. It affects people on a basis of, disability, sexual orientation, their race, their socioeconomic status, right? Their perceptions or their points of views. And I think it's really important that is also nuanced, that it's not just this two-dimensional, like, on a gender basis or on a people of color basis, but also actually sips into different intersectionalities. And, essentially just to nuance intersectionality for people here who might not know it, intersectionality basically is a analytical framework that looks at how our life or our experiences of the world is compounded by our different layers of intersectionality. So, for me, for example, if you look at me, you see a Black person, I'm a woman, and then different intersectionalities could also be like, I'm a mother, I'm a business owner, I'm privileged. So those are the things that, layer on to compound our experience of the world. And it's not always necessarily negative. Sometimes our intersectionality can give us privileges that make our lives easier in some rooms or in some situations, whereas in other rooms and in other situations, they make it more difficult. So just wanted to nuance that a little bit as well for the conversation. So since we're talking about AI ethics, I don't think we actually got to do this in the beginning. What is AI ethics, actually?
Well, it's not this. It's not actually like a really clearly defined definition or field, because it's such a new field. Some people call it AI ethics. Some people call it responsible AI or trustworthy AI. When I use the word AI ethics, I refer to trying to make AI systems beneficial for everyone, but particularly those who are marginalized. Because sometimes if you can't make it work for everyone, at least make it work for those who are in a more vulnerable situation. Like even just when you're landing here at Gardermoen at the airport, you have to go through the passport control if you're in a region, and it's like it does facial recognition on your passport and on you. And the idea of being stopped and manually checked as, I don't know, a Middle Eastern man, I think is much different experience from being like a white Norwegian. And that's what I mean when I say that it should work particularly for those who are marginalized.
So if I can also just nuance that from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, not necessarily from an AI perspective. I think that when we talk about inclusion only happens when it works for everyone, actually. So it needs to work for every single person. It needs to work for the middle-aged white man, for the middle-aged white woman, for the young person, for the Black woman, for the gay person, for, you know, people with disability. It has to work for everyone. Now, just to nuance what you talk about when you say at least make it accessible for people who are marginalized, the thinking around that, at least from an inclusion perspective, is that when you begin to create solutions and you keep people who are most marginalized in mind, when you create those solutions for them, you inadvertently create solutions that are inclusive for everyone else. So just to nuance that. So it doesn't mean that you have to create solutions that does not benefit the majority and that it only benefits the minority. But when you keep the minority in mind in the designing process, you also find that it tends to include everyone else. So just wanted to put
and that is mostly true what you're saying. Like if you're with Siri, when you use a voice assistant, it's like you have to have voice to text for someone who is blind. There's no other way for them to text necessarily, or they could use a keyboard, but yeah. And so with voice to text, it's practical for someone who can see, but for someone who is blind, they actually have to have it. But in the case with this airport facial recognition, it is actually mathematically impossible to make a facial recognition algorithm perform equally well for everyone, because you have to choose how your data needs to be distributed in the demographics. So when I say that it should work for those who are marginalized at the very least, I say that instead of it working 90% well for white males and then 60% well for people of color, I think that it should be 90% well for people of color and 60% for white males if you have to choose. I mean, ideally, it would work equally well for everyone. But if you can't do that, like more white people going through the manual airport security it's not, I don't know if you've ever seen people being treated badly at an airport, but I have, and it's just awful to see people who are wearing hijabs being humiliated by airport staff who should know better.
I think this is an interesting point to lean in on a bit because I hear you and I hear what you're saying. I still do believe, though, that perhaps AI is not where it needs to be currently. I think that when we start, which is what inherently is problematic, is that when we start choosing one group over the other, this is where problems begin. And this is where we start to divert very far away from the goal, which is inclusion. And if currently AI is not meeting or hitting the mark where we need it to hit the mark, my view on this, at least from a DEI perspective, is then use a combination of AI and human beings to make it work. But when we have to start deciding, oh, who should we make it work for the best or for the most, even people who are building that tech, you're building services and systems and structures that are not for you. So I think this is where we are. And I think when we have conversations around diversity and inclusion, we're still very much far away from what we need to be, but it's not impossible, right? AI has come a long way, and from a mathematical basis, right? At least let me just look at from a data science perspective. We can put in, what's the word, like controls in a way. And sometimes that controls could be, right now, the data we have or the systems we have can't do this. How can we marry this with human knowledge? How can we, so like if we're talking about the airport situation, how can we use AI, but also have human beings to say, all right, this is probably just bias that is showing up. So go ahead and you don't have to wait in line. So I'm not saying no. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that the goal is inclusion, and we don't get to inclusion by focusing on one group over the other. It's
definitely, yeah, I completely agree. Like the goal is for it to be beneficial for everyone equally.
Absolutely. Okay, so I want to move on to tech companies. Like in this conversation, you've talked about I think Facebook and maybe Amazon, and perhaps, I've talked about Google, Google Home. So what should tech companies, what do they need to be aware of in the coming years? Especially when we look at things around compliance rules and regulations that will be introduced or should be introduced.
So the good thing about the EU is that they have released a draft proposal for new regulations on AI last year. So it's coming, and it means that more tech companies will be held accountable for having to test for biases. They have to document their data, and they have to document the test results, depending on, it's hitting different sectors differently, but particularly the finance, law, public sector, and HR, employment and stuff like that is being targeted right now. And there might be more sectors being targeted in the future, but those are the ones that are really gonna be regulated in the future and needs to get ready for this. Because with GDPR, it was sort of easy to become compliant in the sense that you just had to write a document, but this is much harder because you actually have to implement technical infrastructure to have the data to report at all, and to mitigate the biases that you have. So this is something that needs to be prepared for, like, right now.
Thanks, Catherine. And what can we do as consumers in how we decide, how we relate to this? So what just comes up for me right now is, with awareness around, climate change and where we're headed into the world, which is not a good place if we continue as we are. A lot of people now know enough about, what they could do. Some people are plant-based, some people, don't eat meat, some people recycle, some people, look into how do we safeguard the ocean? How do we reduce food waste? There are a lot of things we could do. So when you talk about climate change, I think, oh, this, that, all the things we could do. How do we get to this point for AI where we as conscious consumers know what we can choose, what we can support, what we can amplify for a better future ethically with AI?
So I think like increased awareness matters, but at the same time, it doesn't help that much because everybody knows that Facebook is bad, but we still use it because we depend on it. So I think a lot of these issues are about power. And I think for consumers, like try to vote with your money. I think that most of the big tech companies aren't taking enough responsibility. So wherever you can, choose an alternative. Like there are a lot of other search engines that are just as good as Google that you can use. Like Ecosia will plant trees for you when you use their search engine, or DuckDuckGo, which cares about privacy. Or when using a browser, like don't use Google Chrome so they get all the data on you. Use Brave that will block all the ads for you, or Mozilla Firefox, which is also privacy focused. There's like these little steps that you can take to try to use less of the big tech companies' technology, and therefore giving them less data and less monopoly over the AI data market. Yeah, and be critical and be curious. Like if you think you've been subjected to an algorithm when you've been employed somewhere, like according to GDPR, you actually have a right to know that you were processed by an algorithm, and you have a right to know an explanation as to why you were rejected or processed in that manner. So know your rights and use them.
So this is just like the cynicism of the, at least for me, like the real world coming into play, because I do understand the need, you know, to use our voices, but that is not always possible. I think that for those of us who are even able to use our voices, it's a privilege. Some people don't have that privilege. They don't, even just of the coming from a culture where perhaps it's not normal to speak up, or coming from a household where you do things differently. So I think that's just to nuance that yes, we do have the rights to some of these things, but we also need to understand, back to intersectionality, the differences between people, and also the inability for some people to do this. So we have to shift where that responsibility lies, because when we place that responsibility on the individual, not all individuals have the capacity all the time, or the headspace, especially those who are most marginalized, right? So how do we shift the responsibility onto the companies, onto the government, onto policies and structures that enable those things to happen in the first place, right? So it's just about where the power lies and how do we shift it, and where the responsibility lies as well.
I completely agree. Like, I definitely don't think that the way to solve this is to do this consent-based, that like the way you're consenting to cookies, like who reads those things? Or privacy notices. Like it shouldn't be on me to read a privacy notice to know what I'm saying yes to. Like I should be protected by that regardless. But it was just an answer to your question. But if you want to make change, I think regulations are really important, because like the businesses they're not gonna prioritize this unless it hits their bottom line. But this issue is so complex and difficult. It's not an easy thing to sell in a slogan, and it's not an easy thing to lobby to a politician without having enough time with them. And so that's sort of part of the issue, and that's why educating people is step one, so that we can begin to have conversations about this. Yeah, and for those who are in technology, I think like a cultural shift is really important. There's so many technologists who think that technology is neutral. And I think that is where the problem stems from. It's sort of like saying guns don't kill people, people kill people. And it's the same with technology. It's the same with algorithms. Like Facebook is based on the idea that they're gonna mine people's data for money and just sell things to them by monopolizing their attention. Like, how is that neutral? Like, oh, is it good if you use it for to promote climate change ads, and then it's negative if you use it to promote something else? Isn't it just like inherently not good to monopolize people's lives for money? That's at least my opinion.
I mean, absolutely. I think if you look at it definitely from that perspective, I mean, and I think that can also, it's such a clear cut, of course, asking this question comes with, I think most people would agree, like don't monopolize people's, money or livelihoods for money. But then when you also think about it within the context of, I mean, we're in Norway. Norway is a socialist country. It functions on monopolies, right? So also looking into, how even within the systems that are monopolized, can we create structures that are more inclusive? Right, the healthcare system in Norway is monopolized, right? The wine, the alcohol industry is monopolized. A lot of it is monopolized. So within the systems of, I completely agree with what you said. So I'm not like saying no to that. I'm just saying in terms of, I think for me, I guess perhaps I always just think this, also just looking at this from a DEI lens, is we always need to place responsibility somewhere. And I do absolutely agree with you. Like, we need to raise awareness. So people need to know, like the same way we know about climate change, or at least most of us know about climate change, and we know what we can do. There needs to be a lot of, awareness raising, to amplify the importance of this. And then we also need rules and regulations, right? Because otherwise things could very well be suggestions, right? So if we look at the situation in, say, with recycling, I think Oslo, and I may be wrong, but Oslo is one of the few municipalities in Norway that you have to recycle, or you have these bags. You don't have to, but you should. You have these bags. But then when we go up in the mountains, we don't even have bags for like separating things, right? So when you have systems and structures that enables something, it's more easy for people to jump on it,
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's not the monopoly itself that's bad. It's just that the big tech giants, they've just grown so big, there's no one to control them. They can do whatever they want, and that's scary. Like,
absolutely.
There has never been this much power in the world in our history before.
And shared by a few, right? And I think that's also the thing about monopolies, is if there were more competitors, then, it's a little bit more decentralized. But currently, a few people are at the top, and that is, of course, always scary. I know we're coming up on time now, so I'm just going to ask the last question that I have here, which is basically in terms of where can we learn more about AI ethics? Well, I know we can talk about this forever. Where can people learn more about it? And after that, I'd like to jump on the questions and dig into those.
Yeah, so Jacqueline mentioned Coded Bias on Netflix, which is a really good documentary. So I recommend that one. If you're into reading books, like Data Feminism is my go-to. And it's not just for women, just because it's called Data Feminism. It's it gives you a really good overview of a lot of different ethical issues in AI, and a theoretical and practical understanding of what this means in practice and what you can do about it. It gave me so many like aha moments. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, when you
and sorry, yeah, and if you're a company, you can hire me and I'll teach you.
Absolutely. So you can also do that. She's a consultant for hire. I was also going to say about data feminism. Is that right? Data feminism?
Data
Yeah.
feminism.
Yeah, and I found that interesting as well when I read it or when I looked into it. And also one of the things that came up for me while reading into it was that it was not very intersectional, right? It was, so that's also something to keep in mind. So even while we follow even coded ethics or bias, even when we look into some of these things, I think it's always important. And I think you mentioned it earlier as well, Catherine, just to be curious and to ask questions and not be like always ask questions. I think like why and how and why are really good places to start. And until you get to a point where you're fully satisfied with the answer, keep asking questions because it's a really good place to start. But yeah, thank you, Catherine, for answering the questions. This is just basically, you know, when we talked about doing the session, it was just like, let's start the conversation. And really, it was always going to be like a discussion between you and me. And so I'm thankful for everyone who's been here so far, who's participated and who's sent in some questions. Please keep them coming. The first question here is from Michael. And Michael is curious about the type of competences that are needed. Do software developers need to know more about social concepts like intersectionality, or do we need more social scientists in tech, or maybe both? How do you think we can bridge the gap? What do you think, Catherine?
I think, yes, we definitely need both. I think like step one is that software developers know more about social concepts because it's just a lower cost. It's more likely that companies will do it. But in the future, definitely we need more social scientists and anthropologists and historians and people in tech companies to help them navigate the world because we don't learn anything about the world when we learn about engineering in school. And another way to bridge this gap is to have cross-disciplinary teams, which also increases innovation. So yeah, that's one way to deal with that.
Yeah, I think one of the like we do this in my workplace, or I do this a lot, and I think also my teammates, we try to ask the question, is everybody in the room? And I think that's a really good place to start. If you look around you, is everyone who should be involved in this process involved in it? Who are your users? Do you have people who represent your users present in the process? So yes, I think everyone should know about things, right? And educate ourselves as much as we can. But no level of education can give you lived experience, right? So really asking, after you've, learned all you need to about this and you're aware, then ask, is everyone in the room? Who else can be in here that can create more nuance than we can have access to?
Yeah, but at the same time, I think sometimes my impression is that some technical people just can't see that there are people missing in the room because they don't think of that as useful knowledge. And this is like an interesting concept that was studied by Diane Forsyth, which was an anthropologist who studied AI developers, AI researchers, and she found this concept that she called "I am the world," where she saw that engineers tended to think that whatever was right for them was right for the entire world. Like if it worked for them, it worked for the entire world. And this is what I mean with a cultural shift is so important, like to change these mental models that exist in the technical community, from thinking that just because it works for you, just because it makes sense to you, doesn't mean that it makes sense to other people that should be considered. And yes, it matters whether they're white and male.
Absolutely. And I think as well, though, it's not just in the technical world, it's everywhere. It's people who are not technical, it's social scientists, it is people who study gender, I mean, if you look at gender equality, we recently celebrated International Women's Day, so it's relevant. We've been fighting for gender equality for centuries now, right? However, a lot of gender equality is very much around white feminism, or a feminism that does not include intersectionality. So I don't think we can just chuck this to like technical people or people in engineering. It's everybody. You don't know what you don't know. And some people, of course, less than others. So education and awareness raising is important. And definitely imperative to always think about, if we think about it just from a tech perspective, like when people build websites or products or apps, like think about it from a service design perspective. Who's going to use it? What is the customer experience here? And how do I design to meet that need? Right. So I think this is something that, of course, we talk about tech because so far tech has been mainly male dominated. And we have, this whole thing that we say about that annoys me sometimes, that there are no women in tech, because there are a lot of women in tech. But anyways, that's a different conversation. It's basically about everyone needs to understand that we inherently hold unconscious biases about the world, about our knowledge of it, and about our role and places in it, right? So I think it's very important to have that understanding and also bring in the experts. So I think that, bring in Catherine and bring in, DEIB experts, bring in experts on compliance, just bring in everyone that you can to learn.
Definitely.
Because I think this is very important, right? I'm going to try to not destroy another name. So I'm 1 for 1 so far. So Saya or Saja, maybe Saya, I'm guessing, as asked, I assume this issue also applies to voice control or accessibility. And I think this question came in when we were talking about maybe facial recognition.
Or probably how a voice assistance works worse for female voices. I haven't looked specifically on systems, voice control systems for accessibility, but to my knowledge, there currently exists no voice recognition systems that perform equally well for men and women. So probably yes. Probably yes.
And just to add to this, like when we look at in terms of accessibility, well, if we're talking about, say, disability inclusion, the whole world is significantly behind on including people with disabilities and creating solutions for people with disabilities. And something that I think is also worth, nuancing here as well is, just that experience of disability. Because oftentimes when we think about accessibility and people with disability, we think, oh, okay, these are people who are disabled and maybe they need help from us. They are disabled because we don't provide systems and structures that enables them. So I think reframing also how we think about that, even in the codes we create, the products, the initiatives we put into the world, is very important. And so I think, like, from a basis of accessibility, when it concerns people with disability, I think the world is just like significantly behind, and we all need to collectively do better. And it's even things as simple as, your website, things as simple as when you post a picture on LinkedIn, we as individuals have things we could do to create a more accessible structure for people. So if there is a voice control on, say, a website, then it can maybe read something better if it's a picture, especially for people, say, for example, who are blind, right?
And regarding like what you said earlier about if you design it so it works for, people who are marginalized, it'll work better for everyone. This is a good example of that, because if you could design a voice recognition system that would understand the slurring that my father would do because he had a stroke and his entire left side was like paralyzed, so he couldn't pronounce things properly, in addition to having a Vietnamese accent, if he was speaking Norwegian. If you could make it work for him, it would probably work for everyone. So that's just an example of that.
Absolutely. I think as well, since you also brought up a really important thing here, I think accents. So if we're not even looking on the basis of disability, your accents that you come into the world in should not limit you, right? But there are situations where sometimes I'm talking to Siri and Siri's just like, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm like, what do you mean you don't understand what I'm saying? There's a difference between when I say, so I go on like full-blown conversations with Siri and she's super confused, but like even little things as saying water, which is American, and water, which is more say British or Nigerian or, anywhere else. Even something that small needs to be nuanced, right? So I think that's interesting because there are different people in the world with different accents that should all be understood. And I think just tracing this back to human beings, I can't tell you how many times I've been in situations, even to this day, where, somebody says, oh, it's so hard to understand that person, your accent is strong. And I just think, are you listening? How about you try listening? Because they sound differently doesn't necessarily mean that, of course, maybe it's more difficult to understand if they don't speak like you or people you're used to. But if you listen, you can ultimately understand what people are saying, right? So we also have to do the work. And I think just bringing this back to the human being behind the tech. Saya had another comment here, a general thought: could fingerprints be a better solution instead of face recognition at airports?
I don't know how well fingerprint recognition works. I mean, they do work, but do they work equally well for all skin tones? I don't know.
I think fingerprints work well. I think the challenge with fingerprints, though, is does everyone have a fingerprint that is already in a system? What if it's your first time traveling and you've not been in any system, right? Like for people who've spent 30 years in their country or 40 years in their country, and finally a kid moves abroad, gets married, and then you have to go to a wedding, right? How do you navigate that situation where you're not in a system? For people like me who've been traveling my whole life, I mean, pretty much every system, right? I found it quite shocking actually once when I was flying into London, and this guy who was in the customs was like, oh, you went to Utrecht in this year? And I'm just like, I'm sorry, why do you know this? Why do you know this information about me? Right? So I think for people who are well-traveled, sure, that could work. But I think that for people who do not have that type of history, and I think that you also have to look at it from the construct of, say, a lot of emerging market countries don't have the same technical capacity, that like in Norway, for example, I mean, I use bank ID for literally everything, right? Whereas in other cultures or in other countries, that is not necessarily how they do things. So I think that could present some challenges that could also be solved, of course. I don't think that it's a definite no, but I think it's something that could be used, like in addition as well.
That's what Saya suggests, use it as a supplement. It could probably help.
Absolutely. So there's a question here from Kelly Fisher. I'm wondering if you know what types of conversations about biased AI are going on in other parts of the world. What I have mostly seen on the topic is biased AI. Topic of biased AI is from the US and Europe. So I was curious if you knew what these debates and conversations look like in other parts of the world. And I see that Grace has tried to also answer here. She said, this is a good question. Here in the Middle East, this conversation is only starting. Therefore, awareness that AI algorithms, fairness, and AI ethics is something we have to steward. To steward, we need to know what to watch for. We have to make the conversations understandable from school to university to workplace to government. We have to make the conversations about AI ethics clear so that when we have algorithms, we do not block ourselves thinking that we need to be experts in coding to demand to know and to have the right to know. That's a very good nuanced look into it. Thanks a lot, Grace, for that. Catherine, just also going back to Kelly's question, do you have any other points to add? How is discussions around AI ethics showing up in, you talked about, for example, going to a conference in somewhere in Asia? South Korea. Yeah. So how is the conversation happening there, for example?
Yeah, so like most of the conversations that I partake in is also in the US and English because of language barriers. And I don't know exactly what they discuss in Korean in South Korea because I don't speak Korean that well. I only know how to find the toilet. But at that particular conference, I thought it was the first time ever that university was having that conference on gender bias in AI, which is the equivalent of MIT in South Korea. So I think that was good. I know there's some research going on about it in there also, and I know that my colleague or one of the organizers were doing research on how newspaper articles in Korean have gender biases, but I don't know exactly what they discuss. There weren't that much discussion on that conference. It was very like the initial discussions, if you know what I mean. This is an issue. This is like scratching the top of the iceberg a little bit. That's what I experienced in that particular conference, which was in 2019.
So my experience here, so two perspectives. I think not necessarily from a region perspective, but from an intersectional or group perspective. I know some of the challenges that, say, for example, women of color are exploring, and particularly Black women, for example, Black and brown women exploring when it comes to AI ethics, proximity to whiteness, things of this nature. So discussions that go into opportunity, privilege, livelihood, survival. So I can say, for example, and I don't know if it's something anyone here has heard about, I think, actually Catherine talked about it when it came to diagnosis, oftentimes negatively could affect people of color, and their conversations around this, even when it comes to pregnancy and giving birth, where Black and brown women are more likely to die in childbirth than not. And this also comes from both the technologies available to treat them, as well as the bias of the doctors that actually treat them. So that's like a double whammy. So that's one perspective. So I know it's happening in groups and in fractions, depending on what, the challenges are. So I know this is showing up in trans communities. It's showing up in the LGBTQIA plus communities as well, depending on the different ways in which their intersectionality compounds to negatively affect the experience of the world. So that's one aspect. And then another aspect that I think we should also keep in mind, at least that I've, been thinking a lot about, is kind of like, if we think about it from perspective of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like in a lot of African countries, for example, tech is cool, tech is bridging the gap, tech is creating jobs, it's saving lives. So people are not even at the point where they're worrying about how ethical is this, because it's creating opportunities where there are none, right? So if you think about, for example, global warming or climate change, where the West were the points where, or those of us who live in the West were the points where, because we have a lot of other things sorted, like we have healthcare, we have electricity, we can then think about global warming, we can think about what we can recycle, we can think about what we can stop eating, right? Or let's say, for example, not eating meat, whereas in, say, emerging market countries in in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and other parts of the world where you have emerging market countries, they're worried about eating, right? They're worried about electricity, they're worried about education. So they don't even have that capacity to get to the point where you're thinking about AI ethics. And of course, those gaps need to be bridged. And I think oftentimes when we look at challenges that happen in the world, sometimes you find out that you actually have to solve other challenges before you get to the one you need to solve. So just also wanted to nuance that.
But also they might have less of this issue if they have digitized less of their services. Like, this isn't a problem unless your application for a loan is completely digital. Like, if you have to go and meet a person in the bank and fill out a form in paper that a person is reading, it's human bias, it's not algorithmic bias. But
And it's the
also,
human bias that tends to translate into the algorithms as well, because you have situations where, for example, where you don't say in situations where you don't even have that differences in, say, race, right? So if you go to a place like Nigeria, where majority of the people are of the same race, then it could come off in gender, it could come off in ethnocentrism, right? Oh, you're not the right ethnic group, so I'm not going to give you this, and I can tell already because of your name. So it's complex.
Yeah, but also, I don't know exactly what they discuss in China, but one of the good things about China is because of their firewall, they don't allow as many American services in, which means they've created Chinese equivalents to a lot of the services, which means, and they have access to a lot of Chinese data. So from what I understand, I believe that the facial recognition systems they have in China are biased towards white people because they just don't have enough white faces in their training data, and it just works better for Chinese faces, from what I understand. So I don't know if they have the same issues that we have here.
I think, when you talked about, like, say, for example, some countries, they're not as digitalized as, say, the West, right? And I think these are things that will come up. And I wonder if some of the startup and great ideas that come already also kind of anticipates that, they're also going to end up at this point, right? So how do we even bridge that? So I'm just thinking about the leapfrogging, like in Africa, where, they basically just skipped the landlines and they went like nothing to cell phones, right? And that huge leapfrog, which was pretty phenomenal. And thinking about a lot of African countries now, so say like Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, they're actually, if you look at their banking systems are significantly more advanced than the banking systems of the West, than Norway, than the US, right? Because everything happens on the phone, and you don't even sometimes need a smartphone to make this work. So I think also just like, how can companies, I think that could be something quite interesting, is how can we also build solutions for problems that we can already anticipate because we know we're going down the same path. I want to jump quickly on Nikki's question because just paying attention to time here. Nikki says, out of curiosity, I was terrified after watching The Social Dilemma. We all were. Another documentary which talks about the bias that tech ingrains. Some people have said it is a one-sided story. What does Catherine think? Catherine, have you seen The Social Dilemma?
Yeah, I have. It's awful and it's correct, but I don't understand what you say when it's a one-sided story. Like, whose other side is there? Like, big techs, like, poor them, they're so rich that they can't afford to do the right thing because then they'll have a lower profit margin. I don't know, what is the other side? I don't know if Nikki, you want to clarify that or not, but
yeah, I guess just is it really that bad?
Yes.
They yeah.
It is really that bad. Like, one of the people I know, he is an educated, like, both computer scientist and psychologist, and he has specialized in being a behavioral designer. He used to work at DNB and now he works for some other company, but like, he has specialized knowledge in how to make an app so pleasant to use that you want to use it, like how to seduce users. That is his specialty. And he says this knowledge is so secret, like nobody wants to share this, and the only people who actually know anything about this are the people working on it, and especially inside those big tech companies. And they want to keep that knowledge. That's proprietary knowledge. They're not going to share that with anyone. I think there's a lot of things that we don't know and that we can't know, but I think that The Social Dilemma is just as awful as it looks like, because have you noticed how you start scrolling even when you don't want to, even though you know about this, you still do it? It's like, it like just hijacks our most basic human functions, and just bypasses our consciousness.
I'm with you. I think when Nikki said, "Is it really that bad?" I feel like what came up for me is like when people say, "Is gender bias really that bad?" or "Is microaggressions really that bad?" I mean, it's just like micro. Yes, it's absolutely bad. It's terrifying, terrible. It sucks. Don't do it, right? So I think it's and it's. But I wanted to say, I think it was during the one of the questions as well in terms of people who are neutral towards tech. I can tell you that my partner is super neutral towards tech, and he's just like, no, it's fine. I'm just going to put my email, and he's a techie. I'm just going to put my email anywhere, it's fine. And I'm just like, perhaps for you, it's fine. So also like thinking about that as well. For some people, it's neutral. For some people, it doesn't affect how they experience the world. And that is also valid. And it's just in nuancing. For a whole lot of people, though, it affects them. For a whole lot of people, it's not neutral. Really good last question here from Susanna. She says, how much is AI ethics included in the curriculum of web developers at university? Ooh, good question. Do you see a shift happening there?
Like a super slow snail-paced shift. It's coming a bit more, but it's way much slower than it needs to be. And part of the problem is that the AI researchers themselves don't know about this issue, which they should. It's appalling, really. But at the University of Oslo, they have one course that discusses this, but it's very small, but it's very good. At Oslo they started having tech fill instead of what's like the other philosophy thing that that universities have. No, it's like a required course for all students. Xphil, yeah, thank you, that one. So they had TechPhil instead of Xphil, where they teach more about ethics, but short answer is not that much. There should be more. There should be much, much more.
So the businesswoman in me kind of just showed up and just thinking that maybe you or somebody else should make a course and sell it to the universities. Exactly, see? I think Ole agrees with me. Yeah, I think somebody needs to do it, right? Like monetize this and get it into the universities or get a government agency to fund it because it's so needed, right? Because these are future apps and service designers and tech and AI designers, right? Or coders. And they don't have the basic understanding about something that they should. So I think like this is actually a good opportunity to create courses that can be integrated into, a semester or 2 months curriculum of the school that people have to take early on in their careers or in their learning. So as they progress, it's something they think about and it seeps in. So yeah. So any last words from you, Catherine?
This is an important issue and we can all do something by asking questions, being critical, talking about it more, but also, I mean, it's hard to lobby for regulations that you don't understand, but just try to do something and vote with your money. And have all the companies hire me.
I like that. Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much, Catherine, for your time. Thank you for talking to us about this. Thank you for engaging in a conversation about this. To everyone who's here today, thank you for your participation. Thank you for your audience. We very much appreciate you and your time. And we hope we can bring more of these conversations to the world. And yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for your engagement, everyone. Really nice questions, and it's great having you all here, and so nice to see your faces. And thank you so much for having me, Chisholm. Thank you so much for sharing your
Thanks for the
platform.
work you do. Thanks for the work you do.